Okay. You got the big screen there, I'm assuming. Um, hi everybody. Thank you for coming back. And and I wanted to mention a couple things before I start. One that the idea of a vegetable garden and protecting those from mammals came up last week. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about apply to that too. I have a few specific things for that, but um, I did once have an extensive vegetable garden. I just don't now because I can't seem to do both at once, um, time-wise and soil-wise. So hopefully that will be helpful. And then I'm going to have some more things to send you that I didn't get a chance to yet, but that relate to this and last week's talk. Um, so. So this topic, this last one is really near and dear to my heart because it's what first inspired me to start Humane Gardener. And I was working for an animal advocacy organization before that for about 17 years. And at the same time that I was getting interested in gardening and native plants, um, I was also noticing that there were these two different worlds that I navigated where there were sort of strongly animal people and strongly plant people, and there wasn't a lot of crossover. And the plant people were often kind of annoyed with animals and especially irritated with mammals. And the animal people didn't really seem to pay all that much attention to the importance of plants in our own spaces. Like they were thinking about wildlife in the much broader sense. And so I felt like there were some missed opportunities there, especially as I learned more and more from my urban wildlife colleagues. And I wanted to try to build a bridge between the two. But my interest really goes back even further to just almost 5 decades ago now when I was a little kid and I picked up this postcard for my nature collection. And I really treasured this because it depicted an animal I had only ever seen in my picture books. And the story and the caption told this amazing story, amazing tale of just kind of a magical comeback of an animal that had almost gone extinct. And little did I know at the time that in just a few decades, I'd be looking out the window and I'd be seeing that animal every day, and that deer would be eating plants and drinking from the bird baths and taking refuge in our garden. And I couldn't have predicted that instead of celebrating their comeback anymore, people would be cursing the ground that they walk on. And this has really kind of struck me as unfair for years, this wholesale maligning of an entire species that lived on these lands long before any of us did. But the attitude isn't just confined to deer, of course. There's this multi-billion-dollar industry that's invested in making us feel this way pretty much about all the mammals in our midst. So we're surrounded by fear-based messaging about wildlife and pest control advertising that portrays raccoons and other native wildlife as pests, websites that promote removal of animals from gardens and yards as a normal and reasonable thing to do, no matter what. And this is also ubiquitous in the hardware stores that normalize the killing of moles and other animals just mainly to protect turf grass. And in addition to our obsession with lifeless lawns, we've normalized these types of practices too. Not only is this kind of area basically a food desert for insects and birds, but it's also a death trap. And the netting here in front of this apartment building in a community near DC, it was probably placed here to keep mammals out, but birds and snakes and other animals can easily get caught in this stuff. And they do all the time. And just the lucky ones end up in rehab. Even when the advice for gardening among mammals is a non-lethal approach, it's almost always based on a resist and remove type of strategy. Remove the nuts, remove the fruit, thin out the vegetation, take away all the dead wood, plant only plants that animals can't or won't eat. And the problem that I have with this is that it destroys a ton of habitat for all animals, for the mammals as well as for the birds, the butterflies, other insects. This type of advice is really not coexistence, and it can start to be counterproductive. So, for example, if a homeowner randomly decides they don't want opossums in their yard, they can go online, they can find from mainstream sources this kind of advice that will tell them, excuse me, to kill and trap opossums, but also typically advises people to do things like remove all the fruit from the persimmon trees because this is a favorite food of opossums in many areas. But removing fruit for the sake of chasing away a harmless opossum takes away a valuable food resource for so many other animals like this eastern common butterfly, and they nectar on fallen rotting fruit, and a lot of other types of insects go to it too. That's why we can't really welcome animals selectively or decide that we're just going to nurture our garden for this species, but not for that one. And we can't do that without causing a lot of harm to wildlife overall. So to exist with all the animals, we just need to bring back the plants at every life stage, at every layer, which I know I'm preaching to the choir about that. Um, but plants are really the solution to so many of our problems in our relationship with wildlife and specifically with mammals too, because we need these live plants and also their afterlives for them, the fallen leaves, the logs, the decaying stalks in really interesting ways. And all these elements are, of course, important to creating broader habitat, but they're key to resolving conflicts. And people often will say to me, well, you have 2 acres. It's fine for you because you have a fair amount of space and the animals can spread out. But actually, the more space you have, the more animals you can feed. So we don't really have any less nibbling than anyone else does. And in fact, I think we probably have more than most people in my community because as we began to add and nurture plants, the plants brought back the rabbits who hopped down the pathways and started nibbling on things like these new black-eyed Susans and the violets. And they brought in deer who browsed on the sumacs and sassafras and wildflowers and acorns. And the plants fed hungry squirrels who devoured the maple seeds and the walnuts and the insects. And the whole landscape became a playground for, my favorite chipmunks who show up in every single one of my talks. And they tunneled through the beds and they got their snails, and they left their shells on the retaining wall here, buried their nuts. So these mammals are in our habitat, eating all the time, digging, enjoying berries, seeds, insects, flowers, and leaves. But we still have a diverse sanctuary that's filled with a dense mixture of plants. This is in the early spring. Also, dozens of species of butterflies, lots of frogs, native bees. So over time, when I've heard people saying, that deer or rabbits or other furry wild neighbors in my community are eating everything, I certainly do understand the frustration of planting something new, having it chowed down. Really, though, we have to remember what we're starting with and what the animals are starting with. Because often it looks like this. And I don't fault this person. They're trying to do something here, and that's a good thing. They're trying to get rid of at least a little turf. But of course, any animal moseying along is going to take the bait. This is right out in the open. You might as well hang a sign here that says free candy. This is the view from our driveway looking across the road. And this is an extra lot that's been mowed for about 35 years. And I have nothing but affection for the people who own it. They love animals, they're kind to animals. So I'm not trying to throw shade here at them, but most people in my community have lawns that are even bigger than this that they hardly use. But if you're standing here and you turn directly around, this is what you see at our place. There's a lot to go around because we've let things grow and planted. And so you're not going to necessarily notice a nibble here and a nibble there. So when I see this kind of scraping of the land happening everywhere, I have to ask, well, who's really eating everything in our landscapes? And I think we're putting a lot more overemphasis on herbivores when it's our lawnmowers, our bulldozers, our leaf blowers, our mulch bags that keep eating up more plants than anything or anyone else. And we have somewhere between 24 and 30 million deer on the American landscape now. When the Mayflower arrived, there were at least as many, and some estimates have put the number at up to 60 million. And it's true that deer have lost their predators, but we can't deny that we humans have greatly exacerbated the situation by changing their habitat and also translocating them around the country. In the process of removing forests and grasslands, we've changed the landscape in other ways as well. We've displaced populations of ants, who are primary dispersers of understory plants. We've introduced non-native earthworms that eat the duff layer and kind of inhibit the growth of native plant germination. We've introduced non-native slugs who eat seeds but then don't disperse them. And of course, we've introduced those plants from other places that have no natural checks and balances because they haven't evolved in our forests. So when we come to see these mowed down and degraded landscapes is normal, we don't even often realize what's been lost. It's a kind of ecological amnesia. And as Isabella Tree noted in her book Wilding, we are blinded by the immediacy of the present. We look at the landscape and see what's there rather than understanding how much we're now missing. Because this is the natural environment for deer and rabbits and other mammals. It's a place that's covered in plants. And these animals need their greens as much as we do, and turf grass just isn't going to cut it any more than it sustains us. And at this point, a lot of people start to think, well, but aren't deer bad? Don't they spread invasives and cause accidents and eat the forest? And there is some truth to those statements, but there's also a lot more to the story. So let's talk about the invasive plant issue first. We blame the deer for spreading invasive plants in the forests and in our gardens, but then in order to keep the deer out, over the years, the landscaping industry, of course, has promoted and sold the very same invasive plants that we blame the deer for spreading. So over the years, I've even seen lists of deer-resistant plants promoting things like non-native barberry, miscanthus, and butterfly bush. I mean, that was really common when I first started gardening. But don't deer cause accidents? It's true that there are a lot of collisions with deer, but they represent only a fraction of the estimated 365 million vertebrates who are killed under the wheels of our cars each year. And that doesn't even count the number of invertebrates, which is incalculable. In Texas, there's a highway that one scientist called a slaughterhouse for monarch butterflies because of the trucks that go during the migration. And the reason we focus so much on deer is that they're large and accidents with them can cause a lot of damage to us and our cars. A lot more than with other animals, like this little screech owl that my husband and I found in our road. And fortunately, she was treated. She was able to be released, but that's actually pretty rare, right? So I think we need to take a closer look at our own role in this problem too. And one of the things we can do, one of the big things is slow down. And oftentimes accidents aren't preventable, but there are so many that really are, that can be avoided. But don't deer eat the forest. Deer do eat a lot in the forest, and there's no doubt that eating has an impact. But one of the things we have to think about is, do we even have enough historical knowledge to be able to make totally accurate comparisons? Because scientists really only started studying forests in the earliest part of the last century, when our largest herbivores had effectively vanished. Deer had pretty much been shot nearly to extinction by then. And I thought it was really a good summary when the writer and biologist David George Haskell wrote that our cultural and scientific memories of what a normal forest should look like arose at a peculiar moment in history when deer, for the first time in millennia, had been extirpated. The deerless forests of the early and middle 1900s, when all of this research started, were aberrations. But don't deer spread Lyme disease? Deer, as you probably know, don't transmit the bacteria that causes Lyme to black-legged ticks. A lot of other animals do, including some of our most beloved songbirds. And mice are a primary vector, but their role is exacerbated by habitat loss and fragmentation, because when we chop up forests for development and for roads, we reduce populations of their predators like foxes and bobcats and raptors. So the trajectory and transmission of Lyme disease is much more complicated than it's often thought to be, more complex. And really, deer are just one part of many parts in that equation. So regardless of what's going on in the forests or the natural landscapes, many of us are still going to be living among deer in our home landscapes. And even in communities with hunting programs, the goal isn't ever going to be to eliminate deer. So before blaming other species for their mere presence here, I like to ask people, why not figure out what we can do ourselves to mitigate these problems that humans have helped to create? And that really starts with just learning more about these animals and appreciating their existence. It's surprising to learn just how little we know about some of the smaller mammal species and how they're actually doing from a conservation perspective, because there's so little grant money, especially now for natural history research. So the population status, even of animals who are considered common, is often unclear. So we're lucky to still have these animals, and we're even luckier if they grace us with their presence in our gardens, I think. Because yes, they eat their plants, but they eat our plants, but well, it's their plants too, right? But there's so much more that wild mammals do in the process of just going about their days. They're seeders and they're feeders and weeders and soil tillers, pruners, nest builders, not just for themselves, but also for other species. And so they are overall habitat creators. We tend to hear a lot about the non-native species that deer and other animals spread in their travels through our yards and forests. I certainly spread them through my yard, not on purpose, um, but deer are also spreading native seed, and other animals are spreading native seed in their scat and on their fur, and they'll spread some of those awesome native ground covers that we talked about last week, like nimblewill and clearweed, which, in spite of its common name, is not really a weed at all. It's just this gorgeous native annual ground cover. Mammals are also helping to spread some of the little wildflowers. So both of these plants here feed small native bees, and there's even a specialist bee that relies on the pollen of the clasping Venus's looking glass to provision her nest. So deer and other mammals can help pollinators by dispersing the seeds of the plants that they need. I didn't plant these, but they are sort of move around every year. Deer also nourish the squirrels when they drop their antlers, and then the squirrels in turn create natural bird feeders by planting walnuts and acorns that grow into trees, and then those walnuts trees are filled with caterpillars that turn into those gorgeous giant moths so that birds can gather for their young. I mentioned in the first class that bumblebees use old mouse nests. They also use squirrel nests and chipmunk tunnels to build their colonies. Here's an abandoned squirrel nest that someone found in a tree, and it had already been taken up by bumblebees. And leaf litter moths also use squirrel nests that squirrels have already left to lay their eggs in. Other small mammals are forest architects too. As we discussed also a couple weeks ago, mice, chipmunks, voles disperse fungi that nurture plant growth. There's even been research showing that prairie dogs and other little mammals help sequester carbon when they're bringing leaves and other plant material underground. They sculpt the land and they till the soil, and so they're basically subterranean superheroes. And I forgot to add the photo credit to this, and I want to say that this is by Sue Sam, and she has an incredible website called Woodchuck Wonderland, and I interviewed her for an article. So she takes amazing pictures of all kinds of wildlife that you can actually buy for prints and stuff. But thanks to Sue for that one. Moles are one of those superheroes too, because they till the soil and they eat earthworms. And since many of those earthworms are introduced species, the moles can probably help provide some checks and balances there. Moles also create this nice substrate where mosses gather because the hills are raised above the ground around them, and then that keeps the mosses from getting smothered in fallen leaves over the winter. And then these mossy areas are also great for fireflies and amphibians to inhabit. And the molehills provide nesting materials for birds like this Carolina wren. So I saw him plucking mosses from the hills. So moles are actually habitat creators in so many ways that we often don't think about. So dandelions are not native, of course, but they're favorite food for rabbits. And so I don't have enough of them for the rabbits anymore because they're always eating them in the little patch of lawn that remains. And if you have them, they'll help you do a little bit of weeding of some of these areas with clover. They love clover too. This is at the home of a friend of mine in New York who has a huge vegetable garden and a really small urban plot. She's got lots of native plantings too, but she just leaves kind of little eco lawn areas, she calls them, to help take the pressure off the other plants. Foxes and coyotes are on constant patrol for rodents and other smaller mammals, especially when they're gathering food for their young during breeding season. And people often assume that foxes shouldn't be out during the day. They think it must mean that they're rabid or something. But a lot of these animals aren't solely nocturnal. We just tend to think that they are because they're savvy and they've learned to avoid us whenever possible. once we start to appreciate how mammals kind of fit into our communities and home ecosystems, it's important to also learn their behaviors and their preferences because that way we can anticipate their needs and then we can more easily, hopefully, prevent conflicts with them in the garden. And animals have such interesting routines. Sometimes a wildlife camera can help you observe how they move through the landscape. We would never have known that there were foxes coming through here peeing in the same spots every night without this camera. And that's just how they end up communicating with each other. The animal's movements aren't accidental, they can be traced to the presence of desired resources. This is at a farm my friend manages where there's a pear tree that has really become an interesting gathering place just at certain times of the year because of the fallen fruit. So you saw the bears and there's foxes that come next, and then the groundhog will come by. And then toward the end of the pear dropping season comes the little groundhog. So it's just sort of like this little cleanup crew moseying on through. You can observe a lot just by watching how your wild neighbors travel. Once they've found a place they like, deer and rabbits and other animals tend to follow the same paths every day. They have routines just like we do. And it's basically taking the path of least resistance toward their shelter and their food sources. And by observing that behavior, you can actually start to plan for it. You can put plants along the edges that the wildlife don't like to eat, and then mix those tasty plants in with less palatable species that mammals in particular, uh, or put the plants that the wildlife do like to eat, and then mix them with ones that they don't tend to like ferns and sedges, grasses, and some of the bitter tasting forbs. Wild populations fluctuate. So just because you have a lot of rabbits one year doesn't mean you're going to have a lot the next. It's all tied to the broader environment and what's going on with predator populations and how much food is available for different species. If it's a mast year for oak trees, we might see more mice and squirrel breeding. We might see more deer than in subsequent years because there's such an abundant food source from the acorns. Just like us, mammals tend to be opportunists. And I don't think anyone would have thought that the raw common milkweed would be a tasty meal, but groundhogs really find it delicious, it turns out. And rabbits actually like it too toward the end of the season. And the milkweed, of course, will bounce back. It's got those great roots, but it just goes to show that you can't really count on any plant to be animal proof. Flowers and leaves aren't the only things mammals eat. They eat twigs and bark and dried leaves and fungi. And the more you have available for animals, the less you'll notice browsing on any one individual plant in the garden. Skunks provide a lot of ecological services and garden services, but they are subject to so many misunderstandings. So they're just an example of wildlife that really are nothing but helpful. And the reason they get into trouble is because of some human caused stuff. Like usually they're getting in conflict with people's pets and dogs especially don't understand that when skunks are stomping their feet and putting their tail up and circling around, they are actually giving a warning sign, and dogs think it's a sign that they want to play or something. I've had that happen myself before we realized that we should always have our dog on a leash at night when we take her out, and so that was a lesson learned. It's pretty easy to prevent this kind of thing just by understanding who's in your yard and walking your dog on leash at dawn and dusk, even if you have a fenced yard, because that's when these animals are most likely to be out. And it's also important to keep in mind that they're just natural allies in the landscape. And it was only about 100 years ago that farmers in New York were trying to get protections for skunks because they ate so many beetle larvae in their crops. And it's just something we tend to forget about now in the age of pesticides when we turn to the most quick solution. Plant behaviors are often even more misunderstood than animal behaviors, but if people just take the time to watch how plants grow over time, they can start to see the cycles of how they respond to being eaten. And it's actually can be really surprising and also just kind of rewarding to see how resilient the plants really are. The main thing to keep in mind when considering interactions between plants and mammals is that context is everything, like I mentioned. There are seasonal differences, right, that can affect when and how a plant gets eaten. Some plants might pull back on their defenses in the autumn, for example, and then that can make them more vulnerable at that time of the year. Um, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, there are differences in chemical composition even among plants of the same species. So that could explain why um, sometimes if you're getting plants from different places of the same species, some get eaten, some don't, or why deer are eating something in your garden but not touching the same type of plant down the street. Um, so whether a plant gets eaten also depends on the availability of other plants. Are they tastier? Are there tastier plants in the immediate location that they're going to go to instead? Is there enough to eat across the whole neighborhood? And of course, animals' feeding preferences can change, just like ours do. It can depend on what their bodies need at the time, and it can depend just on their own taste buds. Nothing's ever going to be deer proof or rabbit proof. And this is a plant that, again, no one would expect this to get eaten either. I don't think yucca has such tough leaves. But in my habitat, they're one of the few evergreen perennials. So they really stand out to the deer by this time of year or by kind of a couple months from now when there isn't much else to eat. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I keep coughing. I think it's my allergies. But yuccas are resilient, so every summer they recover really beautifully and they just keep spreading and reseeding and providing flowers for yucca moths who pollinate them and laying their eggs in the blossoms in late June. I talked a little bit in the first class about associational defense and associational resistance among plants where they can mingle together and take advantage of each other's defensive traits. When I was researching my second book, Wildscape, one of the most amazing examples that I found of this type of relationship was a tactile one where scientists in Finland discovered that rhododendrons in the forest emit semi-volatile compounds that end up coating the leaves of birch trees growing nearby. And this coating of these natural repellents actually protected the birches from insect herbivores. And that is just mind-blowing to think about how many relationships like this might be happening all around us that we don't even know about. Another way for plants to gain protection through associational resistance is to grow among other species that are sticky or thorny. And this is an interesting case of a plant that's said to be rarely eaten by mammals, the great blue lobelia, but all of the lobelia species get nibbled by rabbits and groundhogs in my habitat if they're left alone. And in this patch here, I thought this great blue lobelia that I had gotten going was completely lost one summer to herbivory. But it turned out that those plants were eventually protected by another flower that surrounded it. And I showed you this one last week, blue waxweed, because it's really good at coming up and holding the ground from silkgrass. But it's also covered in sticky hairs. And it's great for sulfur butterflies and hummingbirds, but the mammals don't like it. So it's kind of acting like a tactile bodyguard here. And it gave the lobelia enough time to invest in its growth in the spring and early summer without being disturbed. This is another one that came up in the protection of black raspberry. I think I showed you the red bud that was doing that too. And then another example of kind of a protective relationship with a species that is usually said to not get eaten. Spice bush, when it's out in the open in my habitat, does get eaten. But when it comes up in these interesting places, like right by this locust tree, or by the fence, or in the shadow of and close to other trees, it doesn't get bothered as much, and it's able to grow tall and berry. You can observe this sort of relationship in all kinds of ecosystems. I love seeing this baby saguaro cacti when I visit the Southwest. They grow within this dense cover of triangle leaf bursage. And you wouldn't really think that the saguaros need protection from herbivores, but sometimes the jackrabbits, the bighorn sheep, the mule deer will munch on these because they have a lot of water content. And so the bursage is resinous, not very palatable. And so in this case, it's the thorny plant that's being protected, and the sticky shrub is the protector, but it's the same type of concept. And plants form these communities all over the world. In England, researchers just a couple of years ago found that former agricultural land quickly turned into forest, despite the fact that there's been a high number of deer there the whole time. And it was the thorny hawthorns and blackberries that helped the forest grow amid even high deer pressure. They had both native and introduced deer there because these shrubs were acting as nurse plants for vulnerable young trees. And it isn't actually a new discovery. 400 years ago, British foresters were advising people to respect the thorn bushes and not mess with them because they protected oak saplings. Here's an example from this summer of that kind of nurse plant effect in our habitat. These are also trees that are said to be deer resistant, but really aren't here when they're young. So persimmons, sycamores. This is another situation where just being surrounded by something unpalatable has allowed them to grow almost tall enough now to withstand browsing without caging. Okay, so um, now I just want to turn to how we can take some of this information about plant and animal behaviors and really help build some new strategies. We'll talk about a few practical things we can do to coexist. First, we can recruit volunteer native plants that serve a dual purpose. Some of these surprise species that come up and can help us feed wildlife. We can intentionally plant botanical buffers and bodyguards by interplanting a mixture of tasty and untasty species. And when planting in more open areas for the first time, we might want to employ gentle exclusion methods through creative use of dead wood or by fencing vulnerable plants until they're established. And if someone's having repeated conflicts, it's really best to remove unintentional bait like birdseed because that tends to draw unnatural concentrations of mammals and other animals to a given area. I think we talked a little bit about that in the Q&A a couple weeks ago. Sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to sharing with mammals because we pull out the very plants that they love to eat. These plants are typically volunteers that get seeded by animals or sprout from the seed bank, and even some of the ones that are tasty to mammals tend to be pretty resilient. Fleabane is a good example of that. And it's too often treated like a weed, even by native plant gardeners. Last week I mentioned how good this can be at keeping problematic plants from germinating, but it's also a wildlife favorite, not just for bees and rabbits and deer, but also for groundhogs. Fleabane is quite a delicacy for them. And this was in a friend's vegetable garden. I love to show this video because this little guy really had a great time that summer, just eating all the little native things that were left to thrive in the pathways, plus the clover and stuff. And it really took the pressure off the more cultivated plantings that became a kind of a buffer plant. Pokeweed is not just a great plant for migratory birds, it's also good deer forage. If you leave it by a pathway, the deer will surely come along if you have a population of deer and nibble on it at certain times of year. And then that serves as another kind of buffer plant that can deter them from more tender plants behind it. And often we hear that pokeweed's going to take over, but it tends to grow prolifically in, again, these disturbed spaces, or maybe some of the bare, highly fertilized spaces, like once it gets a hold in a vegetable garden. And I've also found that even in those cases, deer can help to limit the spread. So you can think of them as natural pruners, or maybe even sometimes natural killers of pokeweed. This is really how much they love it when you have a high population. Last year, this happened to my biggest, largest, most beautiful pokeweed. But I was glad someone found something to eat. And this is why I tell people just leave it, even if you don't like it, it's going to get eaten. Um, And, native plant gardeners already know that violets are important to fritillary butterflies and to native bees, but they can also be really tasty to mammals, especially the flowers. So they can serve as another buffer plant too that deters animals away from other species. So when they're in a path or some other inconvenient spot, I move them into new plantings or under shrubs and perennials. And you can see when when they're fresh and just planted and out in the open how much they get nibbled. But then, of course, soon enough, you can have this whole patch of violets. It can be a great ground cover. And I do something similar with common evening primrose. This is a frequent volunteer and it can live for up to 80 years in the seed bank. So it'll pop up in some pretty unlikely places, and it's great for bees and for moths and goldfinches. And as you can see here, the mammals love it when it's young. So I actually intentionally plant these seedlings to the edges of the paths, and that way they become a buffer plant and they can munch on them as they go along because that's really how they eat a lot of the time, just kind of nibbling here and there as they walk to their next spot. And the evening primrose will still flower there. The blooms just come later and the plant gets shorter and then it starts to reseed further into the garden and mingle with other plants that the mammals don't prefer. Jewelweed, of course, is a deer delicacy and also a great late season nectar plant for bumblebees and hummingbirds that usually just pops up in different spaces. If you have the space, why not let wild native grapes grow? This grapevine is covering a tree snag, and pollinators visit the flowers, and birds and deer and squirrels eat the grapes. Nurturing volunteers as protective bodyguards takes a little bit of patience, but there are quicker ways to build up some defensive barriers through more intentional planting. This is not one of those ways because I didn't plant creatively enough here. A friend had given me some columbines he dug up, and I really didn't have time to do anything but just stick them in the ground before they dried up. And I knew this would probably happen as a result. They were eaten and trampled, and then eaten some more. And if I'm remembering right, I think someone eventually just pulled them out of the ground. But this is a spot where I had planted columbines and also added sedges and other native wildflowers like wild strawberry and barren strawberry. And there's even some Virginia creeper and wild grapes coming in there. And all this diversity allowed the columbines to grow more unfettered and just didn't get noticed as much by the herbivores over time, and then gives it a chance to start seeding into other spots. Here's an example of mixing a chemically defended plant with a more vulnerable one. Woodland phlox. I couldn't get it going ever till I started just sticking it in with the ragwort directly. And then it started seeding in there. And then it's able to reach the flowering stage. And mammals, of course, have learned to avoid ragwort usually because it has alkaloids that aren't great for them to digest. But they use it in other ways. It's a lush ground cover and it adds this sort of structure and security and protection that they're looking for. Virginia bluebells have pyrrolizidine alkaloids. So remember I talked in the first class about how monarchs gather PAs from dried leaves of some plants. Drying bluebells are one of the plants they go to. And so that kind of explains why deer and rabbits really don't like this plant because those alkaloids are hepatotoxic to them and accumulate in their liver. However, mammals do nip off the flowers of young bluebells, especially if you just put them in a few at a time, as I realized. They'll leave the leaves, but the flowers in general are often the least defended parts of plants. And once this patch expanded, they were not touched as much. And I found that has happened in a lot of places. And it's probably because they're not so alone anymore. There's enough to go around, but they also maybe can warn each other to start inducing more defenses the way that plants do. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about because they're not usually surrounded by very many other plants at that time of year. They come out so early. And you can see the sort of protective effect of plants in so many other places once you start encouraging the pioneer plants that colonize disturbed land. And And like there's prolific reseeders that just sprout from the seed bank, like the primrose. They start to fill in the gaps and then they create their own protective community. And when there's so much density, there's still things for mammals to eat, but they tend to pick and choose the stuff that's easily accessible. And I'll show you, I'll talk about this pathway more in a minute. These are a couple of good examples that are in that pathway. These two plants, the primrose and the swamp sunflower, they're always abuzz with life, and they're great reseeders. But again, they just are easy pickings when they're at the edge there. So if you have a spot like mine where the deer and rabbits and groundhogs are full-time residents, some of these tastier plants also can grow well in the embrace of other species that are not so delicious. So that if you want to actually get the tasty stuff going in certain places and not leave it all for the animals to eat, some of these pioneer plants like American burnweed coming up really will help, and purple top grass really will help by surrounding them and helping them get tall enough until they're fortified with their own defenses. And that's why when I'm starting a new area, I don't mind if the path gets narrower and narrower when the pioneer plants move in, even if they're tall, because it provides a kind of short-term protection
I haven't heard anything.
uh, um, to help the other plants get established. Is everything okay there? Okay. Um, And not only is a species like American burnweed a good protector plant, it's also an underappreciated pollinator plant. People will pull this out because they don't really realize how important it can be to solitary wasps, butterflies, bumblebees. Heather Holm had burnweed listed in her wasp book. I was really excited about that because I've seen myself how helpful they can be. Um, of course, the eupatoriums just kind of laugh off everything and keep on growing. Previously, I had mentioned this Eupatorium serotinum, but another real favorite of mine is the Eupatorium hyssopifolium, which I think is very common in New Jersey. This scent is absolutely incredible. And so I keep it kind of wherever it lands, you know. I keep it with the burnweed, and then I can have things like Joe Pye weed get tall enough. If it was out in the open by itself, Joe Pye would never make it. But in this picture, it's almost gone to seed. And it was able to do that because it's in the company of friends. Plants in the mint family, of course, like mountain mint, are some of the most reliably resilient species, and they feed pollinators for many weeks during the season. And we talked before about how helpful they are at holding the ground, which I'm sure you guys well know. They can spread like crazy, but they can also serve as a protective barrier for more tender species nearby. And the deer like to hang out near them, but the mints don't usually appeal to their taste buds at all. And invariably, you'll get some surprises like this popping up. The brown-eyed Susans are very much candy for animals in my habitat. The rabbits especially love them, but they grow quite well among these better defended plants. Pycnanthemum muticum is really the one that does best in our habitat, but of course there's several other native mountain mints that might do just as well in yours. I've had this one before, but it seems to kind of get shaded or crowded out. You can see the protective effect here too. This is brown-eyed Susan with wingstem. And wingstem isn't in the mint family, but it has a bitter taste. It has rough leaves and stems. And so it really spreads even in situations with intensive browsing. And it's quite tall, so it can shelter these other more vulnerable plants growing beneath it. It helps protect wild bergamot, which is a plant that should be able to stand on its own because it's in the mint family, but for some reason it's not as well defended here anymore. These are the wingstem flowers in case you're not familiar with it, and you probably are because it grows a lot on the sides of roads and at the edges of forests now. And this plant is just a pollinator bonanza. I think the Xerces Society found it to be a top pollinator attracting plant. And not only is it deer resilient, but it's another Just another incredible insect plant. A fall sunflower is a lot of fun to mix in with these more tender species. And I couldn't seem to get tall phlox to live up to its name of being tall when I moved it out into our back field. And it would just get browsed over and over again. But then I added lots of fall sunflower and grasses, and now it's thriving there. I had mentioned this plant before, false nettle. It's a host plant for three different butterflies and competes with stilt grass. It's a great reseeder, so now it mingles with the ostrich ferns at the woodland edges, and it provides a bit of protection when it grows near plants that would otherwise also be eaten, like Spigelia myrlandica. It's not quite native here. I don't think it's quite native to you, but I still grow that one. I mean the false nettle is, but not the Indian pink. Excuse me, native thistles offer helpful structural defenses because they're prickly and they're really underappreciated and underplanted. And that's too bad because they offer so many other benefits too. They're so attractive to goldfinches and butterflies, and I've seen American bumblebees on them. But the drums have been beaten so loudly about the need to remove bull thistle and Canada thistle, understandably, but most people still will paint a broad brush over all the other thistles too, and they think that somehow these plants don't belong here. But they really don't spread the way that introduced thistles do. I kind of wish they did, but they seed around a little bit, and if you can get a good patch going, you can benefit from that natural caging effect that they provide. Grasses are important cover, of course, for wildlife, and the seeds are great for birds and other animals, and the grasses can host caterpillars, but they also provide a visual and tactile barrier from some of these tastier plants. And mammals just don't really want to eat grasses to get to the flowers, and that's something Larry Weiner talks about a lot because he'll even plant plugs of vulnerable plants in the same hole with grasses. And you can apply those principles even in a small space. And I found that even in these really well wandered areas, the along the paths, all I need to do is gently push the grass stems around the cardinal flowers and things like that. And it's enough of a deterrence. Ferns aren't going to be very appealing to mammals at most times of the year, at least not for the purpose of eating. But just as with the grasses, they can have this kind of protective effect. These wild geraniums are another one that can't stay out in the open until they get going, but they do well and start to reseed when they're mingling with ferns. And ferns are good shelter, even though deer don't eat them. They love to curl up behind them. And this was a newborn fawn who wedged herself behind our fern patch right next to the wall for a few days while her mom was out foraging. So in vegetable gardens, animals are certainly going to be interested in all the fruits of our labors. So it's helpful to think about providing some alternatives, maybe growing them if you do have an enclosed vegetable garden, or even if it's not enclosed, growing something like wild strawberry that can really spread. And if the chipmunk is eating the cultivated ones or the birds, why not plant the surrounding area also with some permanent native ground cover that they also like? And it'll make a great layer under trees or in between plants. Garlic can be a helpful deterrent at the edges of beds where voles or other mammals are visiting, or mixing in chives into a lot of places. These sort of allium species can be helpful. Or you can also plant native alliums like wild leeks or wild garlics. I've seen them a lot in parks and in natural areas near some of the more vulnerable species. And then if you plant them at home, not only can you do a little bit of harvesting of the leaves and not hurt the natural populations, but you can also have a plant that doesn't get browsed. Sometimes when we're planting in empty open spaces, there's really not any other option but to cage young plants, at least until those plants can literally get off the ground and reach a certain height. This is a small quarter-acre urban garden. It's at a house of one of my native plant friends near DC, and you can see all the shrubs in the background are mature enough to withstand the browsing. She's got lots of deer. So for the younger bushes, like the hazelnuts in the foreground, she caged them a few years ago because otherwise they were just sort of sitting too open in the lawn, and they've got nowhere to hide, and they don't have any plant allies yet. But after just this was just like maybe 4 or 5 years later, and she could take the cages off, and everyone has access to the hazelnuts now, including the deer. And of course, their browsing isn't really going to hurt the plant now that it's this tall. When we use caging to exclude mammals from trees and shrubs, we can also take advantage of that protected ground space to get some of the tastier wildflowers established, rather than adding a bunch of dead mulch around this new elderberry planting. It was so easy to put some native phloxes inside the cage. And then once they had a chance to get established, they start spreading outside the cage and mingling with other plants. And this is another spot where we had started these wildflowers that way, and now they've reseeded into the surrounding area among the grasses and other plants that have a little bit more defenses. Dead wood is one of the best exclusion methods because it's so natural, and just having these little bits of structure along pathways can work surprisingly well for rerouting mammals away from certain areas. The branch here in the middle of the pictures, it's just a simple blockade to a newly planted patch of wildflowers. It's not going to deter rabbits, but that really wasn't the point in this case because I knew it was the deer who would be most likely to eat Joe Pye when it was smaller, and some other plants in there that were still shorter. And sometimes they would knock this branch down, but that was still just enough of a deterrent for them to mostly move along. And so the plants had a chance to get established. And I can never get a very good picture of this, but I've done this around things like Eastern red cedar. It was pretty tall, so I took the cage off, but then they actually pulled off the bottom branches and rubbed it. And so to protect it, I sort of made teepees of branches around it, and it's been there about a year, and it's been working well. And I love these natural elements of that make barriers and deterrents because invariably they can help create unexpected habitat like this tree frog perch. And I was starting to adjust this branch that I had used as a blockade, and then I realized someone had already claimed it. Stumps and logs make great barriers, and we like to think of them as the natural sculptures in our habitat. And when you put them in strategic corners, like at edges, they can help keep herbivores, sort of direct them on a more straight and narrow path. And logs and rocks are also sometimes thought of as nurse objects because they can help plants grow too by holding moisture and casting shade. So they have multiple benefits. And as those natural wood barriers start to break down, of course, the beetles and ants make their homes in the dead wood, and woodpeckers eventually come there. A friend of mine created this sort of living fence for a shrub in her backyard. It's a very rough version of a dead hedge, and she just made it out of stakes and branches, and she had just moved there and was just getting things going, and this was cheap and easy. And after only a couple of years, she removed it because the elderberry's tall enough now. This is a new discovery I've been excited about this past summer. These are willow cone trellises, and I found them online. They've been great for getting plants started in areas that are still really open and where there isn't much to protect them yet. And they look a lot better than metal cages. So if it's near a path or something like that, or if I don't have time to construct a shelter out of dead wood myself, this really does the trick quickly. It's from a company called Master Gardener Products in Washington State. And I even saw native bees start to use the willows, the top of them, to drill and nest into. This is just a little not fancy emergency pond we made because there were frogs dispersing from our other pond in May, and I worried they would not have enough water. So we started it out by using these benches that I got from a neighbor who was getting rid of them. They're old, they're not fancy, but you could do this with nicer ones. And they both gave me a place to sit, and they really protected all these little new plants that I put in there. And I also put a fence rail on some pots on the other side, and no one ate anything. And normally they really would have gone and gotten a lot of those plants. But it was just enough of a sort of tactile barrier. And I always encourage people to avoid the flexible garden netting if they can, because as I mentioned with that netting I showed in front of that apartment building, it entangles snakes and birds, and often there's no one around to rescue these animals from such a horrible fate. It's better to use welded wire fencing like the metal caging we use for trees and shrubs with a large grid or hardware cloth that has really small holes animals can't get stuck in and that isn't flexible. If you don't want to make them yourself or you don't have time, there's store-bought options like this one, especially for small vegetable patches or raised beds or small areas, and you can move them around. So just to get things going, and they're pretty easy to handle. For extreme situations, a temporary cage or fence isn't going to work because groundhogs, for example, can climb trees and fences, and a lot of people don't realize that, probably because of their name. So it's nice to be able to have fruit trees for them too. Um, Persimmons they love. They eat them in our garden. And of course, they can burrow underground, so you have to have a kind of a dual enclosure if you're going to try to keep them out of a vegetable garden or something really formal. Um, and this something like this would deter climbing and digging, but it's a bit of work because you have to make an L-shaped footer. So you have to sink this into the ground about a foot and then make the top wobbly. And then that will presumably keep the groundhogs from going up and over and from digging under. I like to just have a lot of things for them to eat, but I understand that every situation is different. For trees that you want to protect from beavers, if you're in a wetland area, tree wrapping is incredibly effective if you do it right. You can get information about it from the Beaver Institute if you or don't already do that already. Just keeping animals guessing is helpful. I mentioned this when we talked a little about mammals in the Q&A last week about deer. This is at the farm of a woman in Colorado I profiled in my first book, and she welcomes a whole herd on her 5 acres, but to protect certain areas temporarily, she gets creative and uses things like caution tape. Some people will use fishing line and they stretch it taut at head height because that's a surprise to the deer and it can work really well and it's not gonna actually hurt them, but because they don't see it and bump into it, it confuses them and they don't like it. They don't want to oftentimes come back to that area. Eventually they're smart though and they can get used to stuff, so nothing really is probably going to work permanently. You can rotate different visual and scent deterrents, a soap on a stake, maybe not this kind of soap. It's probably not very good for going into the ground, but something smelly, natural and smelly, lets animals know you're around, and anything that signifies that a person is hanging around the space. Sometimes I put my hat on a stake. It actually does work. Motion detecting sprinklers can be effective, but only if you kind of move them around. Otherwise, again, wildlife will learn to anticipate it. I'm not a huge fan of repellents as a permanent tool because of the localized odor pollution they could potentially introduce. It might be hard for bees and moths and other insects to find the flowers, but for smaller gardens or more visible areas, repellents might be a helpful temporary solution while you're trying to get plants established. Um, and avoid predator urine. It's really not what it says it is. There's no way to gather pee from foxes or coyotes or other wild animals in such large quantities unless you're keeping them in intensive captivity. And actually, there was recently an investigation at a fur farm by the organization I used to work for. It's now called Humane World for Animals, and they did find that that fur farm was selling fox or selling predator urine and selling it to some companies. So, when you're buying this, it's either not what it's billed to be, or it's likely collected from animals kept in inhumane conditions. So if you have a more local source for predator pee, you can employ their services. My husband was always a pretty cooperative volunteer on that front. I don't ask him to do that much anymore because we have so much other stuff going on here. Um, but whenever I've needed some humanely sourced predator pee, we have an enclosed enough space that he can go do that for me. The last thing I want to talk about is the conflicts that we unintentionally create in home landscapes by essentially baiting animals. And I see people posting things like this sometimes. Darn deer ate my tulips. No more Mr. Nice Guy around here. Kiss your deer corn goodbye. If you're going to put out food for wild animals, how can you expect them to differentiate between the food you want them to eat, like corn, and the food you don't want them to eat, like tulips, because it's all the same to them. And I think we already talked about this, so I don't need to go into it too much, but bird feeders can easily create that kind of conflict. People get upset when other wildlife come besides birds to their feeders, and they sometimes will even trap and relocate these animals. But of course, that can lead to a lot of suffering. It can have so many consequences from stressing them out during transport, separating them from their young, pretty much dooming them to probably early mortality because they're going to a new territory that they're not cognitively familiar with. So it's actually just not that effective to remove them either because you're creating a vacuum and these animals are all over the place. They're going to come back anyway. So just kind of thinking about ways to feed the birds just with native plants is the best thing. But if you still want to put up a feeder, just kind of putting out just enough for birds during the day, taking it in at night, um, things like that that you can do to prevent these kind of often nighttime conflicts. When animals are eating plants we don't want them to, sometimes we need to just change how we're cultivating. Years ago, I planted rose bushes around a wooden swing, and I wouldn't plant this kind now, these knockout roses, but I wanted to kill the grass back then and plant more flowers. So I put newspaper and mulch over the turf. And one morning I came out, I found all these bushes on the ground. They were kind of honed to spears, and it turned out I had created the perfect habitat for voles because they love the thick mulch. It's warm. Predators can't see them when they're going under the mulch and tunneling their way to your shrubs. And so it was easy for me to fix this. Once I found out, I just removed most of the mulch and the rose bushes grew back, and that didn't happen again. So I just kind of stopped baiting them. I mentioned senna last week and how it grows into almost a hedge in the summer and it feeds all these amazing buzz pollinating bumblebees and sweat bees. This is also a really good plant for resilience to mammal herbivory because sennas contain anthraquinones and they're a laxative. And so it's something that deer and rabbits aren't going to be very interested in. But over the last couple summers, this is how our sennas looked instead. They were really pretty much denuded all the way down. Any leaves that you see on here, there weren't any left the next week. So I just assumed that somehow the deer had adapted to sennas and they were now eating this plant. And then one day I finally saw up close these very camouflaged sleepy orange sulfur caterpillars. And the more I looked, the more of them I found. And I knew that sennas are a host plant for some sulfur butterfly species, and I've even seen adult sulfurs laying their eggs on them every summer. But for some reason, it really hadn't occurred to me that that level of defoliation was due to these tiny little caterpillars. And I couldn't figure out why the flowers were missing, um, in addition to the leaves. Well, this was who was eating the flowers and the flower buds, another kind of sulfur, the cloudless sulfur. And they changed color as they went up to the plant so that as they went up the plant so that by the time they got to the flowers, they matched them and they blended in perfectly. So we can never assume we know who's eating until we take a much closer look. So by working with these creative kinds of approaches, I hope we can help more people have their flowers and their deer too, and their squirrels and rabbits and moles and everyone else who appreciates and deserves are beautiful and abundant habitats. In short, rather than resisting or trying to exclude these animals so much, I just like to try to figure out ways to coexist. Okay, I've gone a little over time, but thank you very much. How do okay, all right, there we go. Does anybody have questions?
Well, someone had their hand up. Well, I want to say, Nancy, I have 10 questions, but I don't want to hog this question session, so I'm not going to ask all of them. Um, but you had mentioned in this presentation bull thistle, and I do know someone who has an entire sort of property filled with bull thistle. So, I mean, it's very difficult to manage. How could we sort of get a little bit of a hold on that so that it isn't taking over every aspect of our yard? Is that, do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, well, I definitely am not promoting bull thistle. I'm hoping people will plant native thistle, but um, I mean, I've had success with thistle with just cardboard and covering it over with wood chips. I don't know if that's too much for this person, but she could do it or he could do it a little bit at a time.
Yeah, that's what we recommend. And she's here tonight. She's here. So I
Oh,
don't, if she feels like talking, then maybe she will. But does anyone else have a question for Nancy for tonight?
Hi, my name is Joan, and I'm trying to balance like this. I'm feeling like there's a purity test, and I'm really trying to understand how to uh, coexist, but also understand that I grow food all over my property, like food that I feed to the soup kitchens, that I feed for my family. And I'm trying to like figure out like, or if I plant like these beautiful that I put a lot of money into native trees, and then the deer come in and they or I don't know if that's the proper word, but they scrape across my trees and then they become infected and all this kind of stuff. So I'm just trying to understand this idea of coexisting. Um, and then dealing with the reality of that we have as sapiens destroyed our mammals habitat through our housing and our deforestation and all this kind of stuff, but how to become a more humane person, like but trying to balance, like I want to grow food, and you yourself said I couldn't do both, and I want to be able to do both.
Well, I could do
So,
both for time reasons,
okay.
not because I think, well, first of all, the tree example, um, do you protect them? Because at any time I plant a new tree, it will get rubbed if I don't, because
Yeah,
it's,
now I do because I got decimated last year. So I protected all of the new plants
yeah.
that I put in. Yes.
I mean, there are some that, like some of the clonal species, they can get rubbed as they start to spread. So I've planted a lot of those, and some of those are like native edibles. A lot of them are like American plum, pawpaw trees. And when those get browsed and rubbed, they're so close together as they start making a grove that that's one way to think about it in terms of
Yeah, my
planting.
pawpaws don't get rubbed. It's my service berries, it's my linden trees, it's
Yeah, those
not
I would
even my
cage.
apples. My apples don't even get rubbed. But it's my baby oaks, that kind of thing.
Yeah, pretty much everything here does get rubbed, but like I said, if once they get going, some of those spreading species um, can sort of protect themselves. For the vegetable garden, I mean, like we talked about last week, I don't know if you enclose any of it,
Yeah,
or do mixed
my
plantings.
vegetables are raised beds. I do enclose, but my asparagus patch, my summer raspberries, my blueberries, like the like deer will come up and they'll just bite the tree, bite my blueberry bushes, and then realize they don't like them, but they've already decimated the blueberry bushes. So
Yeah,
I don't want to do what you said around the nets and all that kind of jazz. So I'm just trying to come up with like what's and like I live in a little bit of seclusion, but I do have close neighbors. So
right.
I am concerned about like the look because I have a neighbor across the street who's constantly giving us feedback about how our house looks. So,
Right.
I'm just
Yeah.
trying to like figure out, cool ways of doing things. And I really appreciate your idea around like the fence rail tactile barriers that I have some ideas popping from that. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that work. It's just a question of for how long and how long do you need it to work? And it just takes kind of, like I said, some creativity. But yeah, I was hoping some of those things would help you. And check out that book, Wildlife Friendly Vegetable Gardener, too. There's another book too that I was going to send the PDF of. That's really a good one for conflict prevention. It's not available in print anymore, but I'll send that along. It's a species by species.
Thank you.
Deborah?
Yeah. Hi. I have a question. I've been, removing certain plants and finding natives underneath, which has been exciting. And then this week, there's an area like the neighbors across the street. There's an area behind their backyards that's just kind of on a street, so there's nothing there, and I found Japanese knotweed. So I went over there and I told them and I started to try to treat them. And then I went up and down the whole area thinking, this could be a great pollinator pathway. And so I started taking an inventory and found a plethora of invasive, plants and multiflora rose and uh, large packs of mugwort. But I also, I don't want to do much with it because I feel like, the mugwort is probably holding the place so that
Mm.
the knotweed doesn't move in. And today I went and I found this beautiful giant pokeweed and I spent the time like taking the porcelain berry off of it and it's, gorgeous. And now I'm thinking, oh, this is wonderful. And now I'm wondering, or I'm thinking that probably, and I found a bunch of other natives in there that are pawpaws and other interesting things.
Hmm.
All these, invasive plants are probably what we're protecting them. So I'm just not sure at what point should I clear them or keep them. It's that fine line of, you're saying like friend or foe, and obviously there's too much of them. But would you, is there any time of year, like would you now do it or in the spring? Is it been
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point about the protecting, like the invasives as a temporary nurse plant. Um, I I tend to, with things like mugwort, pull it when the ground gets soft in the spring, because if you do, you could do it now, but if you do have trees, then they might start to get rubbed or they might get found. So I'd probably wait until spring for that.
okay? Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
yeah.
it's just on a road, so I feel like a lot of deer won't be there because they get hit by cars. So I feel like
Yeah.
the potential to plant a lot of interesting things that wouldn't survive.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you could pull some mugwort and replace it right away with mountain mint and some of the other stalwarts. And you can do that any time of year almost.
yeah, and is it good to take off the porcelain berry vines and things off the trees? Would you say, or is there any protective benefit about for keeping it?
How tall are they?
The pokeweed was about 10 feet tall, and the porcelain berry was just wrapped all around it with the tendrils.
Yeah, I would take it off, yeah, because I think it would eventually smother it.
Okay, that's what I was thinking, and I
Yeah.
think wisteria that it was encroaching, so I kind of like just kind of gave it a little area of its own, and I was thinking, oh, this is wonderful, and then I was thinking, oh no, now is it more of a
Well,
park?
it'll still have its roots probably. So
Yeah, and
yeah.
it's tall. It's about 10 feet tall, so I think
Yeah.
the birds will find it. Hopefully not the deer, but all right.
Yeah.
So there's no better, like in terms of this, it's just when you can replant with something else is the best time to remove something that's undesirable.
Well, yeah, I mean, or if it's actually seeding and bearing, or if you can get it before that, but I think now everything is, right, by this time of year. So
We've already, like it's already seeded.
yeah, so that's probably not a consideration right now.
Got it. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Wow. Oh,
Everybody's tired.
everybody's well, I'll tell you, living in the city, like a very, very urban. I was telling Nancy, I think in one of our email exchanges that I've been part of this group that has been going out in the early mornings at 5:30, 6:30 a.m. because we have tall skyscrapers all around us. So we're collecting data on birds that hit the windows and the window strikes and filling bags of it's horrible, filling bags of dead birds. But we are also rescuing a lot of birds. And I am not leading this effort. I want to give, credit where credit is due. But there is a group here in Jersey City called Jersey City Birds. And they are leading this effort. I'm a volunteer, but it is very humbling to go out and to see some of our favorite birds hitting the windows. So in the city, I think our biggest problem, is deer are around. They're definitely around, but where I live, we are dealing with humans.
Mhm.
And so I think it's a really complicated issue and one that is very different from everybody else that's living in the country. But
Mm.
but Nancy, you kind of you talked a little about that in your earlier classes and with the soundscape and all of that. But I just
Yeah, and actually the bird strikes are a huge issue too. And just I think there was some research about residential bird strikes are even more, the numbers are even higher than skyscraper type buildings.
and I think people don't realize that property owners, but they are really low. Birds hit windows, pretty low. We're not
Yeah,
talking about 20 feet up. We're talking about 6 feet or 6 stories and below.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, I
um,
noticed that on my windows here. I did a really inexpensive, it doesn't really deter from the view out. I did plastic strip across the top, drilled holes in it, and hung parachute wire string. And it moves enough in the wind that the birds, I haven't had one strike on my window since I've done it.
oh, great.
And it was cheap. It was so inexpensive. And I just had my husband drill them every 2.5 inches apart and just hung them down the length of the window. It worked like a charm. Because I was having, if a bird hits my window, I had to do something about it.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
that's great, Pat.
what was that?
I think that's terrific.
Oh, yeah, and I've told my friends that get bird strikes, I said, just do this. It's really inexpensive. I sent them pictures and close-ups of it, and hopefully they do it. But yeah, just my thought to share with the group.
Thank you. Catherine, do you have a question for Nancy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, again, how much I love Nancy, and these talks have been so wonderful. And I also, it's also interesting for me to I participated in the invasive plants webinar that's on Tuesday nights. So it's kind of, an interesting perspective, because we were learning in the invasive plant webinar that the deer are the #1 problem that we have to deal with in terms of resolving the spread of invasive plants. So, and that we have, I mean, historically, I think it was something like 10 deer per square mile, and now we have about 100 per square mile. So, and that it's linked to agricultural practices and decommissioned farms and all that. So, but so
There's different research on it and differences in opinion among even ecologists about it.
yeah, so I appreciate having a different opinion. So now
Yeah.
yeah. But the one thing I also want to say in terms of bringing together different ideas is I appreciate the comments about the birds. And one of the things that I noticed was a sort of a disconnect between the bird people and the native plant people. Gone to a couple of Audubon Society events in South Jersey at Cape May, and the bird people don't know the plants. And so
Yeah.
I hope that we can continue to have like these sort of cross sector conversations, and that the plant people should know about the bird, should know that we'd be turning off our lights now and you can buy decals. You can get them on Amazon. Not that I recommend Amazon, but you can get decals that stick on your windows. We should know, we should know these things. We should know about the plants and the animals. That's why I
Yeah.
really appreciate
Yeah.
it. Thank you. So it was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
That would be a great class, is planting for birds, and gardening for birds.
Well, I have an announcement to make, but before I do, I want to just thank you, Nancy, so much for doing this for us, for the Native Plant Society. And it's been really amazing. I'm so grateful. And do you have anything that you want to tell us? Is anything coming up? I mean, you've got 2 incredible books. If you don't have Nancy's books, you should look into getting The Humane Gardener and Wildscape. They're both terrific. But anything you want to share? We should maybe how we can, I mean, you write for several magazines, and your social media is always something to look out for. But
Oh, thanks. Thank you. I really appreciated being able to join you guys and do this. I think it's such a great series that you have and way to connect a little bit more personally with people. And definitely, I think I just wanted to mention in response to what Joan said about a purity test, my whole goal is to try to just challenge myself too, to think about these things in a different way than sometimes how it's sort of just handed down to us. And see if there aren't other ways we might be able to do things, even if it's just a little bit at a time. Like, I don't think anybody has to, I mean, nobody can do it all at once. We all have things that we could be better about. So I think if there are just things that people can take away, um, that just one thing even that they can do differently to help wildlife and help animals, which you guys are already doing. So I'm not, yeah. I'm happy to just add to the conversation.
Mhm.
Can I'm sorry, just one last thing that I didn't get to say. You talk about fighting plants with plants, and that resource has been incredible for us. We have slopes of stilt grass, and we've raked them to seed. We pulled them and raked to soil and seeded for years in a row. But the problem was we have lesser celandine first, and then we have stilt grass. But we are slowly, it's people that come, there's a creek at the bottom, and people that come to monitor the creek are noticing the difference in vegetation. So slowly over time, we're getting all these wonderful natives coming in, and the stilt grass is slowly beginning to fade. And it's a gentle, long-term approach,
Yeah.
but we can win in the long run.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
win some.
Yeah. Shift the balance. Yeah.
Could I, this is Patty again. Can I ask Susan a quick question? What are you doing about the lesser celandine? Because I just noticed it last year. It's taking over the creek, far side of my creek area.
Nancy's probably better to answer that than me, but we have areas where we put in a lot of Pachyra aurea, the golden ragwort.
Oh,
And-
you did, Nancy, you mentioned golden ragwort a lot.
Yeah. And
Okay.
it is a champion in the forest. And we have some patches that we're tracking where it is actually shading out the lesser celandine in areas where it's just, they make these little bulblets, these little nutlets.
Yeah, yeah,
And in the area where, you dig in the soil and it's just packed with nutlets.
yep,
That's also our stilt grass area.
yeah.
So I should actually turn my video on, sorry. So we've worked with our ecologist, and we're planting, so we've seeded a bunch, but in areas where the seeding isn't taking hold, we are planting sensitive fern with blunt mountain mint, Pycnanthemum muticum, and that we're hoping that's going to spread and help. We're just trying, like Nancy says, to fight plants with plants.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And
So
on the-
whatever's going to grow and be aggressive in that area, put
Yeah.
it in.
I have one other quick question, I think. Something that nobody mentions is my part of my garden got taken over by goutweed. And I've been pulling it and pulling it. Do you have any recommendations of what can outcompete goutweed?
So in DC, in the garden I worked in, we pulled it and then added the Virginia creeper that was growing nearby. And that worked there. And then somebody commented on one of my articles on this and said, I think they were in Connecticut, and they said that they planted anemone in place of goutweed, like after pulling some of it, and that it was working really well. So um, those
Great.
are the two I either know or have heard about. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I think we're going to stop here for now. And I just want to thank everybody again for joining this course and taking this course. I hope you have had a good experience. I know some of you are also in the Tuesday night class. We are finished now for the year, and coming up in the winter, January, February, March, we will have Jared Rosenbaum from Wildridge Plants teaching cultural botany. And then we're going to have Sarah F. Jane with Nature's Action Guide. Has that wonderful book. If you don't have it, you should have it. It's a companion to Doug Tolomei's book, Nature's Best Hope. It tells you how to sort of put all of those concepts into practice. And then I'm very excited to have Dr. Drew Lanham join us for a course in March on cultural conservation and ornithology. So there's a lot to look forward to. Thank you all so much. And Nancy, I just your biggest fan. So thanks.
Thanks, you guys.
All right, everybody have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.